Hello, my name is Professor Adrian Beck, and I would like to spend the next 20 minutes taking you through a brief overview of the total retail loss concept. As I'm sure you're all painfully aware, much of retailing is currently experiencing a profound, deeply disturbing and seismic shock to its very foundations, wrought by governmental and societal responses to a pandemic. Some are arguing that its impact will permanently change the very nature of the retail industry in ways never seen before. Whilst perhaps true, it needs to be recognised that as an industry, retailing is fundamentally built upon and indeed maintained by a process of evolutionary change. For instance, we can see that in the previous 160 years or so, it has moved from a period of rather simplistic and small-scale shops to what we see now, vast, complex stores and shopping malls full of products, offering the consumer a bewildering array of choice and availability. What we've also seen is a dramatic change in the way in which retailing is organised, moving away from a service model primarily based upon shop staff serving customers from behind a counter to one where the shopper is now given free access to browse, select and increasingly pay for the items they wish to purchase with little or no interaction with retail employees. Above all, we have seen the extraordinary growth in the choice of products being made available to suit the needs of an increasingly fickle and demanding consumer population. This sense of evolutionary change is perhaps epitomised by the development of what is increasingly called frictionless shopping, where any barriers to the consumer being able to quickly select and pay for products are removed, such as that seen in the Amazon Go stores where there are no traditional checkout stations. It is also seen in the growth of online shopping, where users can now browse, select and pay for products from the comfort of their armchair and no need to visit the store. The retailer will arrange for your purchases to be delivered to your house or some other convenient location. We've also seen developments in payment in stores as well, particularly the rise of different ways in which customers settle their bill, such as through mobile smart devices and other technologies. Perhaps one of the more striking areas of innovation in retailing can be seen in the growing introduction and use of a wide range of technologies enabling the shopper to check out and pay for their purchases. These developments are particularly evident in the grocery sector, where consumers are increasingly encouraged to use a variety of self-checkout options, including fixed checkout robots, scan and go options where the consumer makes use of a handheld device either provided by the retailer or make use of the consumer's own smartphone. And innovation can also be seen in the growing use of robotics in retailing, such as this device which is used to count stock. So we can see that retailing has seen and will continue to see considerable change in the way in which it evolves to meet and appeal to consumer demands. Retailing has also seen a dramatic change in the nature of the risks that retailers now face. Although the problem of customers taking products from retailers without paying for them is as old as retailing itself and continues to be a significant challenge to control, it is increasingly but one of a growing list of risks that now need to be managed by the retail sector. For instance, the rapid expansion in the ways in which consumers can now pay has opened up new avenues for fraud and loss, and the growth of online shopping has brought with it new forms of risk requiring a need to develop better cybersecurity systems. Indeed, societal changes have also brought new risks in terms of growing concerns about violent crime and how it can impact upon the retail environment. And other innovations in retailing have also broadened the range of risks that retailing is now exposed to, such as the challenges of managing wastage, gift card frauds, damaged products, and indeed the consequences of discounting practices. In addition, developments such as self-checkout, which have been shown to considerably increase the opportunities for retail losses, have also added to the landscape of loss. So retailing has seen a remarkable expansion in the breadth of risks it now has to face. What we can also see is that the data available to retailers to understand the risk landscape has also changed considerably. Not that long ago, the loss prevention industry was considered to be operating in what could be described as a data desert, hardly any accessible information beyond a single measure of missing stock. What we now see is a very different data landscape, one which has moved from a case of famine to feast, with the growth in the capacity and capability of a growing range of information technologies. Retailers are now awash with data, providing unparalleled opportunities to measure and understand the ever-evolving risk landscape that they are now occupying. Retailers now have access to data from a wide range of sources, including digital data feeds from video technologies, the wealth of data collected from retail systems, from consumers and society more generally, that is collectively often described as big data. But we're also seeing other developments, such as the growth of facial and feature recognition systems that create new data points. And there is a massive information that can be collected and collated from online shopping systems as well. Within retail stores, new data points are becoming available, such as from tagging systems like RFID, that can increasingly provide unique insights into product movements and their status. And this rich tapestry of data is being brought together into sophisticated management systems, enabling the loss prevention practitioner to now have an extraordinary oversight on how retail businesses are being affected by the risks they now face. Despite all of this change in the world of retailing, which has seen a veritable revolution in the type and range of products made available to consumers and the way in which they can now interact and pay for them, a remarkable change in the nature and range of risks that the retail community now faces, and an explosion in the capability and capacity to now measure and understand those risks. Despite all of this, for the most part, the retail loss prevention industry has continued to rely upon just one word to describe their area of focus: shrink. It is therefore important to understand what this word means and how it has been used in the industry. When you begin to explore what the available literature has to say about shrink, what you find is that there are multiple interpretations of what it might mean. For instance, here is one example of a definition. Shrinkage is said to mean the difference between book inventory, what the records reflect we have, and actual physical inventory as determined by the process of taking one's inventory on goods on hand, what we count and know we actually have. So in this example, the definition is focused upon physical stock inventory, with shrink being the count of what is missing between expected and actual stock levels. Other definitions, though, take a different approach. For instance, this one offers insights into why shrink may have occurred, in effect, the causes of the loss. The amount of merchandise that disappears due to internal theft, shoplifting, damage, misweighing or mismeasuring, and paperwork errors, whatever they might be. A third definition offers up a much more overarching and inclusive approach to understanding what shrink might mean: intended sales income that was not and cannot be realised. In this example, there is very little guidance as to what the range and type of losses might be beyond a rather generalised assertion about their impact upon sales income. Let's have a look at a couple of real-life examples of the variability in the way in which retail companies define the term shrinkage in their businesses. The first example is from a UK grocer who said that their shrinkage number was derived from a wall-to-wall stock result, but it excludes clothing, all Market Street or fresh food, all of produce such as delicatessen sales, fish and meat, and anything to do with the cafe. So as you can see, many exceptions and caveats to how shrinkage is defined in this business. The second example is from a US grocer and shows how the value of the shrinkage number can vary depending upon its definition. Here, the total shrink number was calculated at cost price for fresh produce, but at retail price for everything else in the store. So when you review the available published definitions of shrink and how it is used in the real world, what you find is that there is tremendous variation between retail companies depending upon type of business, culture, history, and established protocols. What can be concluded is that there is no industry standard. The definition of shrink is very much in the eye of the beholder. So although shrink is a measure of unknown loss, this has not stopped the loss prevention industry trying to understand and apportion causes to this loss. So what we've seen over many years is the segregation of shrink losses into what have often been called the 4 buckets of loss. The first of these buckets contains shrink losses that are thought to be caused by external thieves, often called shoplifters or shop thieves. The second bucket is then filled with losses thought to be due to internal theft by retail employees. The third bucket is then allocated to contain the losses thought to be generated by frauds committed by suppliers or vendors used by retailers. This could be incidents where a vendor will ship less goods than claimed or send goods of a lower quality or value than agreed. The final bucket is then given over to a loose confederation of losses, typically called administrative errors. What these might be is left very much up to the interpretation of individual retailers and might or might not include things like pricing errors, damages, wastage, paperwork errors, and so on. This 4 buckets of loss approach to understanding shrinkage has been very common and can be found used in surveys and publications around the world for very, very many years. But it's very important to stress that the underlying data that is used to apportion losses into each of these buckets typically contains no indicators as to what the actual root causes are. Indeed, it rarely, if ever, sheds light on when a shrink loss event happened, where it happened, who was responsible, how the loss occurred, and indeed why it happened. In this respect, shrink data is a black hole of loss into which practitioners delve to try and apportion responsibility. But in the context of total retail loss, the important message here is that the root cause of shrink is typically unknown. Based upon this context, I embarked upon research to try and begin to develop a more systematic approach to understanding what we mean by retail loss. The research sought to develop a much more overarching, flexible and comprehensive approach to understanding losses occurring across the retail environment. Based upon in-depth interviews with 99 senior retail executives and years of previous research with retailers around the world, the total retail loss concept was launched in 2016. It was then followed up with a second study in 2018, which focused upon developing a better understanding of how the retail industry was using the TR concept and how it should change to take account of new developments and understanding. The remainder of this presentation will use findings from both of these studies. Key to the research was developing some overarching definitions of what we mean when we are talking about retail costs versus retail losses. For costs, the definition was expenditure on activities and investments that are considered to make some form of recognisable contribution to generating current or future retail income. The important point to note here is the emphasis upon making a recognisable contribution. In terms of loss, the definition was events and outcomes that negatively impact retail profitability and make no positive, identifiable and intrinsic contribution to generating income. What is very important here is the emphasis upon making no intrinsic contribution. Another way to think about this is that if a loss event were not to happen, then it would only make things better. It has no positive value whatsoever. So what we can see here are some examples of costs, for instance, such as purchasing of stock, employing staff, and so on. All of these things play a role in delivering income. Examples of losses might be things like customer thefts, or damaged products, or a fire in a store. It is hard to think of ways in which these types of events make any positive or intrinsic contribution to business profitability. An area where these definitions of cost and loss needed further clarification, however, was concerning a group of events that can be described as margin eroders. These are events which negatively impact upon business profitability, but can be seen as playing a role in generating current or future retail income. For instance, things like product markdowns are a way of extracting some value from a product, albeit not as much as originally envisaged. Equally, customer compensation is a way of trying to encourage future sales by increasing the recipient's likelihood to shop again in the future. In other words, margin eroders are examples of a form of retail cost, and as such they should not be viewed as a loss. That is not to say that they should not be carefully measured, managed and controlled, but in terms of developing an unambiguous definition of loss, they should be viewed separately. From this, the research finally developed the total retail loss typology. This is the updated version of the typology, which is published in the second TRL report. As the original research advocated, the typology should be capable of changing as the retail environment changes, and so an important part of the second phase of the work on TRL was to update the typology based upon the latest evidence and experiences from retailers. As such, the original 33 categories of loss were replaced with 42 categories in the version presented here. First of all, you can see that it is structured around the 4 centres of loss: stores, the retail supply chain, e-commerce losses and corporate losses. Let's now look at the losses associated with retail stores, and you can see that the first step is to define those losses that are known versus unknown. As we discussed earlier, most traditional measures of shrinkage generate losses where the cause is unknown, and so they would be in the unknown stock loss category. The remainder is then considered to be losses where the cause is clearly identifiable. It is important at this stage to avoid the compunction to try and categorise the unknown losses into guesses as to what the causes might be. They are called unknown losses for a reason. The next stage is then to break the known losses down firstly into those that are considered to be malicious in nature. So we can see here external theft, internal theft, customer frauds and so on, a total of 6 categories. For a more detailed description and definition of each of these categories, please have a look at the TRL reports. The second set of categories is then non-malicious forms of known losses within the retail store. Here you can see 8 proposed categories including wastage, damaged, misreturns and so on. The next set of categories then refer to the retail supply chain and again are segmented by unknown and known losses, and then malicious and non-malicious. As can be seen, there are fewer categories of loss compared with the retail store, which is partly due to measurability issues, but also the reduced opportunities for some types of loss to occur in this environment. The third area is e-commerce losses, and this section was revised considerably in the latest version of the typology, mainly because in the intervening years, retailers have become much more capable of collecting data on these losses. The losses are now broken down between unknown stock loss and known loss, with 7 categories of malicious loss and 3 categories of non-malicious losses. The new report goes into detail about how each of these categories are defined and valued. No doubt as this area of retailing develops further, the new versions of this part of the typology will be necessary. The final area is then the malicious and non-malicious losses identified at the corporate level, and they include categories such as corporate frauds, workers' compensation claims, regulatory fines and bad debts. Taken together then, this is the total retail loss typology made up of 42 manageably measurable categories of loss across 4 retail centres. Critically, it differentiates between the losses that are known and unknown and those that can be regarded as malicious and non-malicious. The research then went on to capture what adopters regarded as the key benefits of adopting this sort of approach. The first was that it enabled them to better manage retail complexity. As one respondent put it, main advantage, enable you to identify where a company is experiencing losses and direct and guide pyramid heads to respond to them. Act as a roadmap about where asset protection and others need to go. The second reason was that TRL enabled them to generate greater transparency and accountability. As you can see here, one said it has provided much more transparency and clarity about how stores are really performing, taking account of all the costs and losses they have suffered. The third reason was that it created new opportunities to reduce retail losses. As one advocate stated, in less than 3 years we have created many millions of dollars in incremental value to the business. From a standing start, this is not bad at all. Fourthly, respondents felt that TRL enabled them to maximise the potential of the loss prevention team. As one loss prevention practitioner put it, we have been very successful over the past few years on a shrink perspective. Frankly, we are now looking for ways to add value to the organisation to stay relevant. This provides us with an opportunity to do that. Fifthly, it allowed organisational resources to be utilised more effectively. As one said, we didn't realise how big some of the other areas of loss were and how little resource we had allocated to try and fix them. Finally, respondents to the research thought that TRL enabled the business to better understand the range of retail losses that they experience. Here, one respondent clearly articulated their view on this matter when they said, "The one thing that TRL does is that it helps leaders like me communicate to our teams and others that loss prevention is not just about shrink or merchandise loss or cash loss. We now have an impact on things like out of stocks and lost sales, that we have an impact on operational losses and paper shrink, losses in e-commerce world." It offers us a really nice one-page picture of how asset protection supports the business. It allows us to tie it all in. We use it as a way of explaining to people how to understand losses and how they impact upon the organisation. Now, while the research was interested in better understanding the extent to which retail companies had endorsed TRL, it was also concerned with understanding what some of the barriers and challenges to its adoption might be. As can be seen, a range of factors were highlighted, although the two that dominate both relate to data, either that it is spread across the business or that it was missing. These two categories accounted for 2/3 of all responses. As one respondent put it, "This was probably one of the biggest challenges we faced. We have data everywhere. Lost data is all over the place, so getting the data is the more difficult part of this process." The in-depth interviews with retailers also flagged up another issue, and that was the impact of organisational inertia and competing priorities, blocking the adoption of TRL. As one respondent said, "Be aware of organisational inertia that has built up over time. There are hundreds of years of legacy to deal with. That's why you need a change management input to help manage this transition." But another made the point that TRL is a big concept to grapple with and can prove to be too much to take on when other factors are generating concern. I hope this short presentation has provided you with an understanding of the concept of TRL and why some organisations have now begun to adopt this approach. To summarise, as a famous former US general rather elegantly put it, if you dislike change, you're going to dislike irrelevance even more. And this may certainly be the case for those in the loss prevention industry who regard their only responsibility as dealing with unknown loss. While for some parts of the retail sector, it remains a dominant form of loss to focus upon, for others, it is an increasingly but one piece in a broader and more complex picture charting the erosion of retail loss by a range of types of losses. My hope is that the TRL concept will enable the retail industry to strive towards a more coherent, integrated and progressive approach to the management of losses and ultimately the protection of profits. Thanks very much for listening to this today.